My name is Milana Voss. I am 26 years old. And 3 weeks before my wedding, I found out that the dress my grandmother had promised me since I was 7 years old had been sold. Not lost. Not damaged. Sold. For cash. While my grandmother was lying in a hospital bed, unable to speak, unable to sign her name, unable to do anything but breathe, my mother and my older sister had walked into her house, opened the cedar chest in the bedroom, lifted out 60 years of love and careful folding, and handed it to a stranger for money. They used that money to pay for my sister's wedding the year before. A wedding I stood in as a bridesmaid in a dress I bought myself. They never told me. They never told my grandmother. They never told anyone. They just did it, the way people do things they know are wrong, quietly, quickly, and without looking each other in the eye afterward. The morning I found out, my grandmother had been dead for 11 days. Before we go on, please subscribe and like this video, my dear listeners. Your support motivates me to tell even more engaging stories. Now let me take you back to the beginning. To the cedar chest. To the dress. To the woman who wore it first. My grandmother, Vera Voss, was married on a Saturday in September of 1963. She was 22 years old. The dress was made by a seamstress in the city where she grew up, a small woman named Helena who had fled Hungary in 1956 with 2 suitcases and a box of sewing needles and had set up a shop on a narrow street that smelled of bread and diesel. Helena had taken 3 months to make the dress. It was silk dupioni, the color of winter cream, with a fitted bodice hand-embroidered with small flowers that my grandmother always called forget-me-nots, but the formal kind. The sleeves were 3/4 length. The skirt fell straight to the floor and pulled slightly behind. There were 42 buttons down the back, each one covered in matching silk. My grandmother used to say that Helena had been a particular kind of artist, the kind who made things not for recognition but for permanence. Helena didn't have a sign outside her shop for the first 3 years she was open. She didn't believe in advertising. She believed in reputation, which she said was slower and truer. People found her by word of mouth, by the way a collar sat on someone at church, by the way a sleeve moved in a way that sleeves in other shops did not move. By the time my grandmother found her, Helena had a waiting list of 4 months and worked 6 days a week from 7 in the morning until she ran out of light. She had made my grandmother's dress from a design they developed together over 5 appointments. My grandmother would tell me about those appointments sometimes, on the Sundays when the tea was already gone and neither of us was in a hurry and she was feeling something she couldn't quite contain. She described sitting in Helena's shop on a low chair while Helena walked around her with a measuring tape and a small notebook, writing things in her own shorthand that my grandmother said looked like a foreign language. She described the way Helena would sometimes stop mid-measurement and stand very still looking at something in the air in front of her, like she was reading a blueprint that no one else could see. At the 3rd appointment, Helena showed my grandmother a sketch. My grandmother said she cried. She said she hadn't expected to cry. She was not, she told me, a woman who cried over sketches of dresses. She was a practical person with a practical education and a practical view of most things. But the sketch was her. It was exactly her, not some version of what a bride was supposed to look like, not the shapes she had seen in magazines, but her, the shoulders she had, the height she was, the way she stood. She said it felt like being seen by someone who didn't need to be told first. Helena had said, when my grandmother tried to explain why she was crying, I know. It happens sometimes. It means we got it right. And she had offered my grandmother a small glass of something that turned out to be plum brandy, which was 11 in the morning, and they had both drunk it and then returned to the fitting. My grandmother told me about those buttons the first time she showed me the dress. I was 7. She lifted the lid of the cedar chest herself, slowly, the way she did everything, like time was a gift she didn't intend to waste. The smell that came out of that chest was like nothing I had ever smelled before. Cedar and something floral, and underneath it, something I can only describe as old. Not musty. Old. The way a library smells old, or a church. She lifted the dress by its hanger. It was wrapped in tissue paper, the kind that had yellowed slightly at the edges. She peeled back the tissue and held the dress in front of the window that overlooked the garden, and the light came through the silk in a way that made it look like something that had been lit from inside. 42 buttons, she said. She turned it so I could see the back. Your grandfather counted them the night before the wedding. He was nervous, and he couldn't sleep, and he called me at 11 o'clock at night and asked me how many buttons were on the back of my dress. She smiled at the memory, the smile she kept only for him, even 15 years after he died. I told him 42. He said, I'll undo every one of them myself. And he did. She folded the tissue back over the dress. She settled it into the cedar chest. She looked at me for a long moment with the gray eyes that I had inherited and my sister had not. This dress will be yours, she said. On your wedding day. I was 7 years old. I didn't fully understand what that meant. But I understood the weight of it. You understand weight before you understand everything else. My grandmother told me the same thing at 9, at 12, at 15, at 19 when I left for university. And at 23 when I came home for Christmas the year my grandfather's bench in the garden finally rotted through and she replaced it with a new one and cried a little into her coffee and thought I hadn't seen. Every time, she said it the same way. Not like a promise you make to a child to keep them quiet. Like a covenant. Like something already true that she was simply reminding me of. That dress will be yours, Milana. On your wedding day. My sister Daria is 4 years older than me. She is the kind of beautiful that makes rooms rearrange themselves. She has my mother's coloring, dark hair, green eyes, a laugh that carries. She had been the center of our family's attention since before I was born, in the way that some people are the center of a room not because they demand it, but because gravity simply works differently around them. I had understood this about Daria since I was old enough to understand anything. I had made my peace with it, or what I thought was peace, which I later came to understand was just quietness. Daria got engaged when she was 27 to a man named Tomas, who sold commercial real estate and drove a car that my father called a statement. The engagement party was held at my parents' house on a Saturday in October. My grandmother came. She sat in the garden in her good coat with a glass of wine she barely touched and watched Daria and Tomas receive congratulations from 40 people, and I sat beside her for most of the evening because there was nowhere else I wanted to be. At one point my mother came and crouched beside my grandmother's chair and said something to her low enough that I couldn't hear. My grandmother's face didn't change, but something in her eyes did. A door closing behind them. I didn't ask what was said. I should have. The wedding was the following June. It was beautiful in the way that Daria's everything was beautiful, large and expensive and arranged within an inch of its life. The flowers were imported. The venue had a waiting list. There were 300 guests and a band that played until 2 in the morning and a cake that had been photographed for a magazine. I was a bridesmaid. I wore a blush-colored dress I had ordered online and paid for myself. I stood on the left side of the altar and watched my sister marry Tomas in a dress I had never seen before and did not ask about until later. At the time, I simply thought, Daria chose something new. That was so like her. Something contemporary, something hers, something that cost what it cost and looked the way it looked. I didn't think about the cedar chest. I should have. I want to tell you something about Stefan before I continue, because he matters to this story in a way that is quiet but true. Stefan Kral was not someone I had fallen for immediately. We had met through a mutual friend at a dinner party in the autumn, a dinner party I had almost not gone to because it was a Thursday and I was tired and I had a report to finish. I had gone because my friend Clara had specifically said, "There's a person I want you to meet," not in the matchmaking way but in the honest way, the way people say it when they mean, "I think you would find this person interesting and I want to see if I'm right." He was interesting. He was a structural engineer who spent his days thinking about how buildings stayed standing, which he described without grandiosity as making sure things hold. He had grown up in a small town in the hills, the son of a mechanic and a music teacher, and he carried with him the particular quality of people who come from places where things are made by hand and repaired when they break, a quality of noticing physical things, of being present in the material world in a way that urban-grown people sometimes aren't. He noticed when a window frame was badly fitted. He noticed when a floor was slightly off level. He noticed, on our second meeting, that I had been crying and hadn't mentioned it, and he asked, simply, if I was okay, and then accepted my answer without pressing it. We had taken a year to become what we became. That year was not dramatic. It was made of small things: long walks, late meals, the habit of calling each other in the evenings, the accumulation of inside references, the gradual building of a private language that belongs to two people and no one else. He met my grandmother at Easter, the year before she had her stroke, when she was still fully herself, garden and tea and gray eyes and all. She watched him over the rim of her cup for the duration of an entire meal before she said anything to me. After he left to use the bathroom, she said, "He has good hands." She meant it in the specific way she meant it. He had helped her carry in the firewood without being asked, and he had stacked it correctly, which is not a thing everyone knows how to do. And she had watched him figure out the right size to split the logs without being told, which told her something. She made assessments the way a craftsperson makes assessments, by looking at the work. He asked me on a hill in August with a bottle of wine and the city below us, and the particular quality of summer light that only exists in that last hour before it goes. He did it with a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, not an engagement ring, but a small garnet ring she had worn on her right hand for 40 years, which he had asked his mother's permission to offer me as a placeholder while I chose what I actually wanted. I found this so exactly right that I didn't even process the question for a moment. I just looked at the ring and the care behind it and said yes before he finished the sentence. I called my grandmother from the car on the drive home. She picked up on the second ring. I said, "We're getting married." She said, "Of course you are." She said, "Bring him Sunday." She said, "I have things to show him." I said, "Don't overwhelm him." She said, "I'll use the good cups," which was the highest social honor she bestowed. He came on Sunday. She made him sit across from her, and she asked him questions in her precise way, not interrogating, but evaluating, the way she evaluated everything, with full attention and no performance. She asked him what he was working on. She asked him about the town he grew up in. She asked him if he thought our apartment had structural issues, because the ceiling in the hall had been making a sound she had noticed on her last visit, and he said yes, probably the expansion joint. And she nodded as though this was the correct answer to a much larger question. After he went to look at the ceiling, she said to me across the table, "He'll be patient with the buttons." I said, "The 42 buttons." She said, "They take about 20 minutes if you're not in a hurry." And she smiled the smile that was only for the people she had decided on. My grandmother had her first stroke 11 months after Daria's wedding. She was 81. It happened on a Tuesday morning in her kitchen while she was making tea. Her neighbor Irina found her on the floor an hour later. She had not lost consciousness entirely, but she could not speak clearly, and her right side didn't work the way it was supposed to, and by the time the ambulance arrived she had gone somewhere further inside herself that none of us could follow. She spent 6 weeks in the hospital. I went every other day. My mother went on Sundays reliably. My father went twice. Daria came once, in the 3rd week, and stood in the doorway of my grandmother's room in a yellow coat and said she looked much better than expected, and left after 30 minutes because Tomas was waiting in the car. My grandmother couldn't speak during that time, not clearly, not in words that assembled themselves into sentences. But she could look at you. And the way she looked at me when I came into her room was not the look of a woman who had given up. It was the look of a woman who had something left to say and was waiting for the machinery to catch up. She came home in March. She had a part-time nurse, a woman named Bozina who wore rubber-soled shoes and smelled of lavender, and had the calm of someone who had seen everything twice and found most of it manageable. My grandmother improved, slowly, the way things improve when the improvement is real rather than performed. Her speech returned in pieces, words first, then phrases, then sentences that arrived slightly sideways and then corrected themselves. Her right hand was slower than it had been. But she was home. She was in her garden. She was in her chair. I visited every Sunday. We would sit in the kitchen with tea she couldn't pour herself yet, and she would tell me things. About her childhood. About Helena the seamstress. about the winter of 1963 and what it felt like to put on that dress in the small room above Helena's shop while the city went gray with November outside, and Helena pinned the last seam and said, "You look like the answer to a question I forgot I was asking." Those Sundays were not easy and they were not sad. They were what they were, the specific texture of time spent with a person you know is leaving, which has its own kind of weight and its own kind of light, different from ordinary time but not worse than it. She was sharper in some ways during those months than she had been for years. Focused. Particular. She told me things in a specific order, not the rambling order of ordinary reminiscence, but the deliberate order of a person who is deciding what matters and choosing to give it. She told me about my grandfather, Jan Voss, who had died when I was 11 and whom I remembered primarily as a pair of large dry hands and a smell of pipe tobacco and the specific way he laughed, which started quiet and got louder, and who had apparently been a man of extraordinary tenderness in private, in ways my grandmother had never had reason to share with anyone because there was no reason, they were private. She told me he had left her a letter when he died, a long one, which she had read once and then folded and put in a place she didn't tell me about, and had never read again, not because it was too painful but because it was perfect. And she did not want to wear it out. She told me about her own mother, who had been a schoolteacher in a town I had never visited, who had wanted to be a pianist but had not had the money for training and had become a schoolteacher instead and had been good at it in the particular way of people who are good at the second thing because they understand loss. She told me her mother had come to see her try on the dress the morning of the wedding, just the two of them, before anyone else arrived, and had stood in the doorway of the room and looked at her for a long moment and said only, "Your grandfather would have been so proud," and then had gone downstairs and made coffee and never mentioned the dress again, because she was that generation. She told me she had made a will in August, a thorough one, and that Petra Sedlakova had it, and I should not worry about the details because the details were handled. But that I should know that she had thought about everything and she had decided everything carefully, and she had made it as right as she could make it from where she was sitting. I did not ask about the dress during those Sundays. I realize now that some part of me understood something was complicated, some shift in the air around the subject, and I had chosen not to press it. I had thought, maybe she is tired. Maybe she doesn't want to talk about weddings and futures when she is managing her own present. I gave her the grace I thought she needed. I did not know she was giving me something back. I did not know that every Sunday she sat across from me not saying what she knew was an act of protection, her choosing peace over accusation for the time she had left, while simultaneously making sure the correction was already in motion. She told me things in those months that she had never told anyone. I think she knew she was running out of Sundays. She died on the second Thursday in November. Quietly in her own bed, with Bozina in the next room and a cup of tea on the nightstand that had gone cold before the end. I got the call at 7 in the morning. I drove to her house in 20 minutes and sat with her for an hour before anyone else arrived, in the way that sometimes you are given an hour that you do not deserve and do not explain. My mother and Daria came together. My father came separately, 20 minutes later, looking like a man who had been interrupted. There was the particular organized sorrow of a family that has prepared for a death and is now executing the preparation. Phone calls. Arrangements. The name of the funeral home on a card in my mother's wallet, because my mother kept these things in her wallet, organized and ready. I went home that evening. I sat on my floor. I did not eat anything. I had been engaged to Stefan for 3 months. We had met through a friend. We had taken a year to become something. We had sat on a hill in August with a bottle of wine, and he had asked me, and I had said yes and called my grandmother first. She had said, "Of course you did." She had said, "Bring him Sunday." She had made him tea and watched him with those gray eyes and afterward said nothing except that he had good hands, which was, from my grandmother, something close to a blessing. We had talked about the dress. She had said she would have Bozina help her take it out of the chest and check the condition. She had said she might need to have 2 of the seams let out slightly, because I was taller than she had been, and we had both laughed about that. We had talked about the 42 buttons. She had said Stefan would have patience for them. I had said I hoped she was right. That was October. She was dead in November. I waited 2 weeks after the funeral. I waited because there are things you cannot do while you are still simply surviving the loss. Then, on a Sunday afternoon, I drove to her house, which was now in the process of being sorted, my mother and father having been named in the estate along with Daria and me, and I asked my mother where the dress was. She was standing at the kitchen counter going through my grandmother's papers with a cup of coffee at her elbow. She didn't look up immediately. Which dress? The wedding dress. The 1963 dress. In the cedar chest. My mother set down the papers. She looked at the counter. She picked up her coffee. She took a sip. She put it down. All of this took about 8 seconds, and in those 8 seconds I understood something that I could not yet name, but could already feel in my chest like a change in air pressure. That dress was sold, she said. I waited. I thought I had misheard her. Sold, I said. Yes. She picked up the papers again. Daria needed it. I stood in my grandmother's kitchen, which smelled of the lavender bozina used and faintly of the rosemary my grandmother had dried in bundles above the window for 20 years, and I waited for the sentence to make sense. It did not make sense. Let me explain what it feels like to be told something like this in a place like that. My grandmother's kitchen had not changed in the 26 years I had been alive. The tiles were the same green and white pattern she had chosen herself in 1978. The window above the sink looked out on the garden where the rosemary grew, where the bench had been replaced and the bench before that had also been replaced, where the apple tree in the corner had been planted by my grandfather and grown into the shape of something that seemed to have decided for itself where to go. The cups on the hooks beside the window were the same mismatched collection she had assembled over decades, one from a hotel in Vienna, one that had been her mother's. Two that matched because she had bought them at a market in 1985 and had always used them for guests. Standing in that kitchen and hearing those words felt like the floor had shifted slightly without moving. Like the room was the same and something inside me had changed its orientation. Daria needed it, I said. The wedding was expensive, Milana. My mother's voice had taken on the particular tone she used when she had decided something was finished. Calm. Final. Slightly resigned, as though the inconvenience was mine. The venue went over budget. Tomasa's family contributed what they could. We needed to cover the difference. You sold Grandma's dress. We made a decision. She was in the hospital. She was not in a condition to. She was in the hospital. She was alive. You sold her dress while she was alive and you didn't ask her. My mother looked at me then. The look was not guilty. That was the thing that hit me hardest later, when I had time to examine it. It was not guilty. It was slightly irritated, the way you are irritated when someone is making something complicated that you have already decided was simple. Your grandmother would have wanted Daria to have a beautiful wedding. I need to sit with that sentence for a moment, because it is the sentence that tells you everything. Your grandmother would have wanted Daria to have a beautiful wedding. Not, we asked her and she agreed. Not, she knew and she was fine with it. Not even, we made a mistake and we're sorry. Just, she would have wanted. As if my grandmother's wants could be assigned by the people who hadn't asked her. As if they knew her well enough to speak for her, having spent the last few years not particularly bothering to listen to her. My grandmother would have wanted Daria to have a beautiful wedding. What my grandmother had actually wanted, and said, and repeated for 19 years, was that I should have the dress. That was her actual want, stated directly, in her own voice, on multiple occasions. But that want was inconvenient. So it was replaced with a hypothetical, a one that was invented for her, a want that served the people doing the inventing. I left the house. I drove home. I sat in my car in my parking spot for 25 minutes before I was able to go inside. The next morning I called Daria. Daria picked up on the third ring. She was somewhere with background noise, a coffee shop, maybe, or a lobby. I heard the particular sound of a large room. Did you know? I said. When it was happening. Did you know it was Grandma's dress? There was a pause that told me everything. Not a pause of confusion. A pause of calculation. It wasn't practical to leave it in a chest, Milana. It was promised to me. You weren't even engaged. I am engaged now. It was a very old dress. The condition was perfect, Daria. She maintained it for 60 years. She showed it to me my whole life. You know what it meant. Another pause. When Daria spoke again, Her voice had shifted into a register I recognized, the one that meant she had decided to be reasonable at me, which was the thing she did instead of apologizing. Look, I know you're upset. You just lost Grandma and you're dealing with a lot. But this was a practical decision that had to be made at the time, and it was made by the adults who were responsible for. I was 25 when you sold it. I was an adult. You weren't involved in the finances. It wasn't a financial asset. It was a dress she promised to me specifically. By name. Multiple times. In front of witnesses. Daria sighed. Milana. I'm sorry you feel this way. I feel this way, I thought. Not, we did something wrong. Not, we should have told you. Not even, I wish it had been different. I feel this way, as though my feelings were a weather event that had arrived inconveniently. Who bought it? I said. What? Who bought the dress? Who did you sell it to? A longer pause. I don't see how that. Who bought it, Daria? She told me. A man named Benedict Havel. A collector of vintage textiles and fashion artifacts. He had a house in the hills outside the city, a large property, and he bought things. Old things. Beautiful things. He had paid, and here Daria said the number in a tone that was meant to explain the transaction. To make it sensible, he had paid 8,000 euros. 8,000 euros. For a dress my grandmother had been given as a wedding gift by a seamstress who had crossed Europe with sewing needles in her luggage. For a dress with 42 silk-covered buttons that my grandfather had undone one by one on a September night in 1963. I wrote down the name. I looked it up. I found him. His name appeared in several articles about vintage fashion collections and estate acquisitions. There was a photograph of him from an exhibition opening, a man in his 60s, gray at the temples, the kind of face that had been handsome once and had settled into authority. He had a website for his collection, which was called the Havel Archive. It listed acquisitions by category. One category was bridal couture, 1940 to 1970. I hired a lawyer. Her name was Petra Sedlakova, and she had been my grandmother's lawyer for 11 years. I knew her name because my grandmother had mentioned her occasionally, in the way she mentioned people she trusted briefly, precisely, without elaboration. A good woman, she had said once. She has a brain like a filing cabinet and a conscience like a compass. I had found her number in my grandmother's address book, the small brown one she kept in the kitchen drawer beside the spare batteries. I called on a Wednesday morning. Petra Sedlakova answered on the second ring and said her name the way people say their name when they are used to their name meaning something. I told her who I was. There was a brief silence, and then she said, Milana. Yes. I've been waiting for you to call. I stopped. I was standing in my hallway with my coat still on. You've been waiting for me to call. Your grandmother asked me to hold certain documents until you made contact after her death. She anticipated that you would need them. She was very clear about the situation. My legs felt uncertain. I sat down on the floor of my hallway with my coat on. What documents? Petra Sedlakova told me that my grandmother had come to her office in September, 2 months before she died, during the period of her recovery, when her speech was still returning and her right hand was slow, and had dictated and then signed. With Bozina as witness and with a second independent witness Petra had arranged, a formal letter of testamentary intent and a supplementary legal declaration regarding a specific item of personal property. The item was the dress. The document stated clearly that the silk Dupioni wedding dress, made by Helena Kovar in 1963 and worn by Vera Anna Voss née Blazkova on September 14th of that year, was the personal property of Vera Voss and had been verbally promised on multiple occasions to her younger granddaughter, Milana Eva Voss, to be received upon the occasion of Milana's marriage. The document noted that Vera Voss had been made aware, in the spring of the same year, that the dress had been removed from her property and sold without her consent during her hospitalization. The document noted that this transaction had not been authorized, that she had not been consulted, and that it was her explicit and legally registered wish that the dress be recovered and transferred to Milana upon her marriage, or at Milana's request. There was also, in the document, a paragraph I had to read twice. It said, I did not confront my daughter-in-law or my granddaughter Daria about this act during my lifetime because I chose to spend my remaining time in peace. But I want it recorded that I knew. I want it recorded that what was done without my knowledge or permission. I want it recorded that the dress was not theirs to sell. And I want it recorded that Milana was always meant to have it and that this was my decision, made before any of them were born. My grandmother had known. For months, she had known. She had sat across from me in her kitchen every Sunday and made tea and told me about Helena the seamstress and the 42 buttons and the September light, and she had known the entire time that the dress was gone. She had known, and she had not told me because she had been doing something instead. She had been making it right. I sat on my hallway floor for a long time after I got off the phone with Petra. I sat there until Stefan came home and found me and sat down on the floor beside me without asking any questions, which was one of the things about him that I had decided to love for the rest of my life. I told him everything. He sat and listened with the steady kind of attention he had, the kind that didn't fidget, didn't interrupt, didn't perform its own feelings over yours. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you need to do first?" What I needed to do first was go to Benedict Havel's house. I called him. His number was on the contact page of the Havel Archive website, a general inquiries address. I wrote an email explaining who I was and who my grandmother was and what I was looking for. I asked if he would be willing to meet. He responded within 6 hours. He said yes. He said he had been expecting to hear from someone. His house was 40 minutes outside the city, past the reservoir and up a long road that went through oak trees and came out at a stone property with iron gates and a courtyard. It was the kind of house that had been in one family for a long time and had been maintained rather than renovated, which gave it the look of something genuine rather than performed. He met me at the front door himself. Benedict Havel was 67, taller than I had expected, with the careful movements of a person who lived among breakable things. He shook my hand properly. He offered coffee. He led me through a hallway lined with glass cases that held hats, gloves, folded lengths of fabric. A textile museum contained within a private home. We sat in a room that overlooked the courtyard. He poured coffee into small cups. He looked at me across the table with the measured attention of a man who had spent 60 years deciding what things were worth. "Your grandmother's dress," he said, without preamble. "Yes. I bought it 14 months ago. The transaction was conducted by your mother and your sister." He said this carefully, the way you say something that you know to be wrong and are not going to pretend otherwise. I paid 8,000 euros, which is below market value for a piece of that provenance and condition. I was told it was being sold from an estate. My grandmother was alive. Yes. He looked at his coffee. I found that out later. I have been, I will say honestly, uncomfortable about this purchase since I confirmed that information. I looked at him. He looked back. He was not performing discomfort. He was simply uncomfortable, in the plain way of someone who had done something that turned out to be wrong and had not yet figured out how to correct it. "I have the dress," he said. "It is in the condition it was in when I received it. I have not exhibited it. I have kept it in archival storage." He paused. "I will return it to you. I want to be clear about that. I am not going to ask you to buy it back. It does not belong to me. It never properly did." I didn't say anything for a moment. I had prepared myself for a negotiation. I had prepared myself for resistance, for claims of legal ownership, for the particular coldness of someone who has purchased something and intends to keep it. I had not prepared myself for this. "I'll need your documentation," I said. "For the legal process." "Of course." He had a folder on the table beside him. He pushed it across to me. Inside were copies of the purchase transaction, photographs of the dress taken on the day he received it, and a written statement in his own hand, signed and dated, describing how the purchase had been represented to him and when he had learned that the seller had not been the owner. "My lawyer is named Petra Sedlikova," I said. "I know that name." He looked mildly surprised. "I've dealt with her office before in other matters. She is thorough. My grandmother chose her for a reason." He nodded. "Your grandmother sounds like someone who arranged things carefully." "She was," I said. "She arranged this for 11 years. He brought me to the room where the dress was stored. It was a long, Narrow room with controlled temperature and filtered light, the kind of room that costs money to maintain and exists because the person maintaining it believes in permanence. The dress hung on a padded hanger inside a sealed garment bag made of archival cotton. He unzipped the bag. The dress was exactly as I remembered it. Silk du Peony Winter Cream, the color that exists in that particular family of white that is warmer than white and cooler than ivory and doesn't have a name that fully contains it. The hand-embroidered flowers on the bodice. The three-quarter sleeves. The straight skirt that pulled slightly. And along the back, all 42 buttons, each one covered in matching silk, each one in its loop, every one accounted for. It smelled faintly of cedar still. It had always smelled of cedar. I pressed my hands together at my sides so I would not reach for it immediately. I am not sure why. Some sense that this moment should take its full time. You can take it today, Benedict Havel said. He had stepped slightly back, the way people step back when something doesn't belong to them. I need to complete the legal transfer first, I said. Through Petra. So that it's documented properly. He nodded. I'll call her office tomorrow. I looked at the dress for another long moment. I thought about my grandmother in her kitchen on a Sunday in October, recovering the use of her words, making tea with her slow right hand, telling me nothing about what she knew. I thought about her in Petra Sedlakova's office, dictating carefully, getting the words right, making sure it was recorded. I thought about 42 buttons and a September night in 1963 and a woman who had kept a promise for 63 years even when the people around her had decided it wasn't theirs to keep. Thank you, I said to Benedict Havel. Thank your grandmother, he said. The legal process took 3 weeks. Petra was thorough in the way my grandmother had said she was thorough. She filed the declaration with the appropriate registries. She sent formal notice to my mother and to Daria, advising them of the documented claim. She handled the transfer of possession from Benedict Havel to me with the precision of someone who understood that the point was not just the dress, but the record, the permanent, unambiguous record that this had happened, that it had been wrong, and that it had been corrected. My mother called me 4 days after receiving Petra's letter. The call came at 8 in the evening on a Tuesday. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and a stack of papers from work. I looked at the screen. I considered not answering. I answered. This is unnecessary, my mother said. Her voice had the particular quality I had grown up with, the one that communicated that whatever was happening to her. Dragging this through lawyers. Your grandmother would not have wanted this. Grandma arranged this herself, I said, with her lawyer, while she was recovering from the stroke. This is what she wanted. Milana, your grandmother was not entirely. Don't finish that sentence. A pause. She was not entirely in her full capacity at that time, my mother said, and finished it. I looked at the wall above my kitchen table, where there was a small framed print my grandmother had given me years ago, a botanical drawing of rosemary, Salvia rosmarinus, for remembrance, she had said when she gave it to me. Though I don't think you'll need the reminder. She had 2 witnesses, I said, an independent witness arranged by her lawyer. Her speech had returned. She dictated the document herself and signed it. Her lawyer of 11 years handled the execution. If you want to contest the validity of that document, you will need to make that argument to a judge. Another pause. Longer this time. All of this over a dress. All of this over whether what she said to me for 19 years meant anything. My mother's voice shifted slightly. Not softer, not apologetic, but something more complicated than before. We needed the money. You needed to ask. She would have said no. I know, I said. That was the point. I hung up. I sat with my tea until it went cold. Then I called Stefan and told him how it had gone, and he listened in the way he listened. And when I was done, he said, "You know what this means, right?" And I said, "What?" And he said, 42 buttons. I'm going to need to practice. I laughed. The kind of laugh that comes up from somewhere below your ribs, the kind that has something else
Sí, y
mixed
eso.
into it.
Entonces,
Daria called 2 days later.
básicamente,
She did
por
not
eso
call in
estaba
the
mi llamada
evening.
con el IKEA.
She called at 11
Hemos
in the morning,
comprado
which told me she had been
una
working up to
de
it
esta del
since she
IKEA,
woke up.
o
I
sea, la
want to
misma,
explain, she
exactamente la
said.
misma, el mismo
Okay,
modelo,
we were in a
la
real financial
campana, y
crisis with the
ahora hay
wedding.
que decírselo a la chica
Tomas's
esta.
parents pulled funding at the last minute. The venue
Es lo que
required the full
teníamos que
payment
hacer, o
8 weeks
sea,
out.
al final
We were short by
se
11,000
rompe algo y se
euros,
tiene que
and
pagar.
we'd already sent the
Y
invitations
nada,
to
se tenemos que decir a
300
esta
people, and
chica por
I.
tema
She
fianza y todas esas
stopped.
cosas.
I
Lo
panicked.
que pasa es que
I
tengo
waited.
miedo de
Mom
cómo pueda
suggested it, Daria
reaccionar.
said. I want you to know
Porque, a
that.
ver, la fianza
I
está
didn't
para
think of
pagar
it.
cosas así de
She
haces
said the dress was
desperfectos y
sitting
tal,
in a
y ya
chest,
está.
and it was worth money, and
Pero
Grandma was in the
yo soy
hospital,
sincera, yo le he
and
dicho a
we didn't
Fata que
know what
tengo
was going to
miedo,
happen, and
en
did you think
plan,
about me? I
miedo del
said,
punto de
not about
decirle,
Grandma,
Fata,
about me.
es
Did you
que,
think, Milana has been
es
promised
que no
this
sé, no
dress? Did you think
sé,
that? A
tengo
long
miedo de que me haga
silence.
algo a mí.
Yes, Daria said.
Entonces yo no sé
I
vosotros cómo
thought
lo
about it.
veríais. O sea, es un tema delicado,
And
es
I
un tema que a lo
thought,
mejor
I
no
thought
debería
you weren't
hablar por aquí,
engaged. I thought it
pero
might be
necesito
years.
realmente
I
vuestra
thought by then
opinión
we
y
could have
vuestra
replaced it
ayuda
with
de cómo
something.
decirlo
Something new,
sin que
something just
pase
as good.
nada,
You
porque,
thought you could replace a
o
dress my
sea,
grandmother
es un
wore when
tema que
she
ahora
married
mismo, o
my
sea,
grandfather.
tema casa
Daria
está
didn't say
arreglado,
anything. You thought you
tema
could replace
exámenes está
60 years of her
arreglado,
keeping it for me. Still nothing.
tema todo
I'm not
está
going to tell you
arreglado.
that you're a bad person, I said.
Consulta con las otras
I
personas,
don't
pero
know if you're a
solo
bad
está Bárbara
person,
y
but
Fata
I
va a
need you to
venir.
understand that this
Entonces,
wasn't
menos
about
mal
the
que Fata
dress.
está aquí,
It was
porque
about whether
Fata
my
va a venir el
grandmother's word
29,
meant
menos
anything in
mal,
this family,
y va a estar
and what
aquí
you and
y va a
Mom
ayudar,
decided while she
y
was
menos
lying in a
mal,
hospital
y a
bed
ver, no creo que
was
pase
that it didn't.
absolutamente nada.
I heard Daria exhale
La cosa es que
slowly.
no sabemos
I'm
cuándo se
sorry,
va
she
esta
said.
chica.
It came out
En plan,
smaller
se va
than I
el
think she
30, pero no
intended.
sabemos si por la
It came
mañana o
out
por
like
la
something
tarde.
she had been keeping in a
Porque,
tight fist and had finally
sí,
let
por
go
la
of
mañana
because she was
esta,
tired.
yo creo que
I know, I said.
Bárbara sí que
I did
está.
not say,
Pero
it's
si es
okay.
por la
I did
tarde,
not
Bárbara no
say,
viene
I
hasta las 10
forgive
de la
you.
noche.
I said,
Y
I know, because I
básicamente
believed her,
Fata y
and
yo estaríamos
because
nosotros y
sometimes
ya
the
está.
honest thing to say is only the true thing,
No
not
sé.
the full thing.
Tipo en
We
grupo
didn't
y
speak
tal,
for a while
comentárselo
after
con el
that.
tío sin intentar
Not a
choque con ella.
final
Claro, es que es
silence,
eso.
not a
Es que
cutting off.
eso es lo
Just the particular
que...
quiet of two
Pero como
people
se
who
lo tengo
love
dicho
each
con
other
A ver,
and
es
have
que
hurt
lo que
each
dice
other
David es lo
and
que
are
hemos
trying
estado
to figure
haciendo,
out what comes next without
Bárbara y yo,
performing
desde
a
que pasó
reconciliation
este
neither of
problema,
them
de
is
que se lo
ready
hemos
for yet.
comentado a
I got
buenas
the dress back on
y
a
a la
Friday in
mínima salta.
February.
O sea, nosotras
Petra called me at
es
noon
que
and said
lo
the
juro por
transfer
lo que
was
más
complete
quiero,
and the
se lo hemos
documentation was
intentado decir
filed
bien,
and I could collect it at
siempre
any
se lo hemos
time.
intentado decir
I
bien,
drove to Benedict
hemos
Hovel's
intentado
house
ir
that
poco a
afternoon
poco y ya a la
alone
primera de
without
turno
telling
salta.
anyone except Stefan.
Igual no
I
nos vamos
parked
a
in the
más problemas.
courtyard.
Es que es
A
eso.
young woman from his
O sea,
household
da
brought
igual
the
cómo
dress
le
out
digas
in its
las cosas
archival
porque
garment
salta.
bag and placed it carefully
Entonces
in my
es
back
algo
seat,
que
and
yo
I
tengo
thanked
miedo,
her,
que
and
no
I
debería
sat
de
in the
tener
car for
miedo
a
por el
moment
simple hecho
before
de
I
que,
started the engine.
joder,
I
sus
drove home
consecuencias, ¿sabéis?
slowly.
O sea,
I put the dress in
yo
the
si
closet
hiciese
in our
algo en este
bedroom,
piso,
still in the garment bag. I stood
obviamente,
at the closet for a little while.
se ha roto
Then I
por
called my
uso, no pasa
grandmother's
nada,
neighbor
pero si se ha
Irina,
roto
who had found her on the
porque
kitchen
he
floor,
causado un
and
incendio, he
called the
causado
ambulance,
inundación
and who
o
had been
lo he
bringing
roto y ya
flowers to
está,
her grave every other week since November.
porque yo que sé, me ha
I have
apetecido,
it,
yo
I
que sé,
said. I
me
wanted you
parece
to know.
normal que me
I have
quiten
the
de mi
dress.
fianza, o sea, pero
Irina
porque
was quiet
yo
for
soy
a
una persona
moment.
normal.
She would be
Lo
so
que pasa es
pleased,
que hay
she
otras
said finally.
personas como esta
Her
chica
voice was the particular kind of
que se
warn
le
that
va.
belongs to
O
women
sea,
in their
ella ha hecho
70s who
esto y
have
dice, ya,
seen
pero ha
things
sido sin
resolve
querer,
and
ya,
things
ha
not
sido sin
resolve
querer,
and have learned to
pero
tell the
por mucho que haya
difference.
sido sin
She
querer,
was
no
so
tenemos que
worried
pagarlo
in those
nosotras.
last
No sé
months.
si me
She
entendéis.
talked to me about it. She said,
Entonces,
Irina,
como
I am trying
que
to fix what was done. I want
tengo
Milana to
estrés
have it
por
for
eso.
her
O sea, ya
wedding.
no tengo estrés por
She
tema
fixed it,
casa
I
ni por
said.
esas cosas,
Yes,
porque
Irina said.
tema casa ya
She
lo hemos
did.
arreglado,
The
vamos a
wedding
estar
is in
aquí
June,
y
a
esas
Saturday,
cosas,
because my
pero ahora
grandmother
ya
was
es
married
tema
on a Saturday,
de decir
and I
las
am
cosas.
superstitious in ways
Y que
I'm willing to admit.
mañana no, el
We are
30,
being
vamos a
married in a
cambiar
small
el
ceremony
bombín
in the garden of a
de la
country
puerta
house
por si
outside the
acaso. O sea,
city.
nosotros tenemos
30
un bombín
guests.
con unas llaves
Stefan's mother
de
is making the
seguridad.
food,
Eso es
which she has
decir,
been
no
quietly
se pueden
delighted
hacer
about for
copias.
months.
Pero
There
no
will be wine
saben, o sea,
from
no
the
se pueden hacer
region where
copias a
my
menos que
grandmother
tengan
grew
el
up.
código que yo
There
tengo
will
en
be
una
rosemary
tarjeta.
on
La
every
cosa es
table,
que
in
no
small
sabemos
glass
quién conoce a esta
bottles,
chica, no sabemos
tied with white
absolutamente
ribbon.
nada. Entonces
Bozina
puede
is
ser que le hayan
coming.
hecho una
She
copia o
asked,
lo que
when I
sea.
called
Entonces
to
vamos a
invite her
cambiar
if it would be
por
appropriate,
tema
she
miedo.
said, I was
Y
only
eso,
her
entonces
nurse.
además de que
It
yo me
wouldn't be
voy y
strange.
Bárbara, bueno,
I
estará
told
aquí
her she
más,
had been there for things
pero
no
yo
one
qué
else
sé,
had seen,
por si
and
pasa
that was
algo,
not
¿sabéis?
nothing, and that I wanted her
Ay, mira,
there.
¿por qué pasa esta
She
muchacha? Ya
cried
lo
a
sé.
little.
O
I
sea,
let
cuando
her,
os digo que
because
yo no
some
tengo
things
miedo a
deserve to be
nada,
cried
tengo
over.
miedo a decirle
Petra
las
said
cosas. Con
Lakova
eso
is
lo digo
coming.
todo.
I asked her
Es
because
que
my
quien no me
grandmother
toda la vida,
trusted her,
no se lo
and
no
my
sé qué le
grandmother's
ocurre, qué
trust
rabia,
was not
ya se
given
evidencia,
easily.
por si acaso
Irina
no
is
lo...
coming
Claro,
with her
es eso.
sister, who I have never
Entonces,
met,
por eso, o sea,
but
adoro
Irina
que
said she
de
talks about
verdad
my
me estéis
grandmother
apoyando,
sometimes, and I
de
said
verdad que
bring
sí.
her. Benedict Hubble sent a card when he heard the date. He said he was glad it had worked out. He said he hoped the dress would travel well. He included a small note about Helena Kovar, the seamstress, information he had looked up because he said he felt he owed it to the provenance. Helena had lived until 1991. She had been buried in Vienna. She had continued sewing until her late 70s. She had, according to a brief obituary he had found in an Austrian newspaper, described her greatest professional satisfaction as making women look as brave as they actually are. I read that sentence 3 times. I have not shown the dress to Stefan. He knows it exists. He knows what it means. He asked me once, shortly after I got it back, if I wanted to show it to him, and I said, not until the morning, not until it's going to be that day. He understood this without explanation, the way he understands things I don't always fully explain. My mother will not be at the wedding. This is not something I decided in anger. It is something I decided in February, sitting with Petra going over the documentation, looking at a transaction record that showed my mother's signature authorizing the sale of a dress her mother-in-law had never authorized her to sell. I decided it not because I hate my mother, but because I have spent 26 years being a person who accepted that things were taken from me and said nothing, because the alternative was conflict, and I was the quiet one, I was the one who managed. I was the one who was fine. I decided it because my grandmother had spent months of her recovery arranging for me to not be that person anymore. Because what she had done was not just recover the dress. What she had done was leave me a record that said, this was real. What I promised you was real. What happened to it was wrong. And you are allowed to say so. My father sent an email last month asking if we could meet for coffee. I have not replied yet. I think I will, eventually. I think there is a version of this where we find our way back to something smaller than before, less pretending, but real. I do not know yet. I am leaving that door on its hinge. Daria sent a gift 2 weeks ago. A small box, no card, just her handwriting on the label. Inside was a spool of silk thread, ivory, the kind used by seamstresses for bridal work. A spool and nothing else. I held it in my hands for a long time trying to decide what it meant. I think it means, I know. I think it means, I'm sorry in the only way I currently know how to say it. I put it in the cedar chest. Yes, the cedar chest. I have it. It was in my grandmother's house, and I asked my father, who is handling the estate, to release it to me, and he did without argument, which was either guilt or generosity and possibly both. It sits in my bedroom now. It smells of cedar and rosemary and whatever that older smell is that has no name. In it I have put the thread from Daria and a photograph of my grandmother on her wedding day in 1963, which Irina found in a box of photographs and gave me, and a single dried sprig of rosemary from my grandmother's garden, which Irina also found, tied with a piece of kitchen string as though someone had prepared it to be kept. Maybe someone had. Maybe my grandmother had. I am at the point where I don't put anything past her. In the photograph, she is 22 years old and standing in front of a building I don't recognize with the dress on and her dark hair pinned back, and she is looking directly at the camera with the gray eyes I inherited and a look on her face that is not exactly a smile, but is something better than a smile, a look of complete self-possession, the look of a woman who knows exactly where she is and has chosen to be there. I have looked at that photograph many times since Irina gave it to me. I have looked at it on ordinary evenings and on difficult evenings and on the evening after I signed the final legal transfer documents and sat alone in my kitchen with a glass of wine and felt, for the first time in months, the particular relief of something resolved. I have looked at it and tried to find in her face what she already knew at 22 that I am still working toward at 26. I think what she knew is this, that the things worth keeping are worth the trouble of keeping them. Not in the sentimental way that sounds like a greeting card, but in the literal way, the cedar and the tissue paper, the archival box, the going to see Petra Sedlakova when her right hand was slow and her words still arrived sideways, the making sure it was written down. She knew that love without documentation is just intention, and intention without documentation can be argued with.
no pasa
She had
nada.
spent 60
Gracias,
years
chicos,
keeping
en
that
plan,
dress in the condition it
es mal,
deserved.
porque está claro
She
que
had
el
spent the
problema no es
last months of
vuestro
her life
y nosotros
keeping the
nos vamos
promise in the
lo que
same
vaya a pasar.
condition.
Puedo tener
I
esta
think
persona
she
y
also
digo,
knew
sí.
something about what
O sea,
families
ya
do
sé
when they are
que
under
nos cuentas
pressure,
que claro,
that
es
they
que ya
reach
sé
for
que no
what
está
is
en mis
available,
manos. Lo que
that
pasa
they
es que
justify
obviamente
it to
en mi
themselves in
mente,
the
en
moment,
estos momentos,
that they tell themselves the
están
person
pasando
it
como un
belongs to won't
montón,
mind or will
un
understand or
montón
would want this
de
anyway. She
cosas
had watched her
posibles. O
family
sea,
long enough to know what they
o
were
sea,
capable of. She had made her plan accordingly.
esperaros.
She had not been bitter about it, or at least she had not allowed the bitterness to be the loudest thing. She had simply been prepared. That is the thing I carry from her that is harder to put in a legal document. The preparation. The understanding that love is not
Y ya
passive,
está, porque
that
es
it
que
is
no
a
me sé
thing you
nada,
arrange,
tío.
a thing you
Duración de la
tend,
encuesta.
a
Tenéis 2
thing you take
minutos.
active steps to protect. Not because you don't trust
Pues
the people
eso,
you love,
entonces,
but because you
ya sé que no,
understand
pero,
that
o sea, os
circumstances can
prometo
make
que he
people into
estado,
things they
he
wouldn't
estado
otherwise be,
en mi
and the best thing you can
mente
do is make
imaginando
the right
cualquier
thing
tipo de
easy
situación. O
and
sea,
the wrong thing
imaginaos hasta
hard.
qué punto de
She
que
made the right thing easy
justo
for
el día
me.
que estaba
She made
sobrepensando
it
me
as
apareció
easy
un
as
vídeo
she
de una
possibly
chica que le
could
habían tirado
from where she
ácido
was,
y
with what
todo
she had left. She could
por
not give me back the
venganza,
year
por
I had
envidia o yo
spent
qué
not
sé el qué.
knowing.
O sea, es que
She could
pensaba
not give
hasta
me
eso,
back
que
the Sunday I
obviamente
had sat in
no
my
creo que
grandmother's
pase.
kitchen
O sea,
after the
no,
funeral
no
and
creo.
asked about the dress
Pero me
and felt
entendéis,
the
¿no? En
floor
plan, he
shift.
estado así
But she could
como
give me the
mi mente
documentation.
ha
She could give me
estado
Petra. She could give me the formal record that said,
muy
this was
sumida
real,
en
this was
puede
mine,
pasar esto,
and
puede
this is what was done
pegarme,
to it, and this is who put it right.
no sé,
She
escupirme,
put it
yo qué
right.
sé.
I will wear that dress
Y
on a
bueno,
Saturday
si
in
coge y
June.
dice,
I will
ay, me
stand in a
quedo,
garden
obviamente
with
sus
30
fuerzas
people
estarán
who
fuera
love
del
me,
piso,
and at least
así que
one of
no
them will
puede,
cry
y
before I
vamos a
get to
cambiar
the
el combi,
altar,
así que no puede
and it
volver
will
a entrar,
probably be
si no quiere
Irina.
dejar las llaves.
Stefan will be in a
Entonces,
dark suit with a white flower in his lapel,
claro, y
because
es
I
que,
asked him for that.
como veis, soy
His
una
hands will be
sobrepensadora
steady.
nata.
I know this because his
Me
hands are always
auto
steady.
triste,
And
pero
somewhere
cierto,
between the
si ella
car
ataca, tú
and the garden,
contraataca.
I will take a
Obviamente,
full
es que,
breath
¿sabes qué
and
pasa?
think
Que
of
por
my
una parte,
grandmother,
si ella ataca, si
who
yo
wore this dress
contraataco,
60 years before me
si
and
cojo y la
spent 60
denuncio por
years
haberme
making sure it
agredido,
got back to
ella
me,
siempre puede
and
decir,
who
es que ella
sat in
también
a
me ha
lawyer's
atacado.
office with
Entonces,
her
claro,
slow right
obviamente sé
hand
que
and
Fata
her
se va a poner
returning words and
delante
said,
y que yo
record
puedo con
this.
ella. O
Make
sea,
sure this
esta
is written
chica es
down.
más pequeña que
Make
yo, o
sure
sea, mide
Milana knows that it was
1,50,
always hers.
te
I will
agredió.
think of
No,
42
digo que
buttons
sí, en
and a
el caso de
September
que
night
me
and a
agreda,
man
¿sabéis?
counting in the
No sé,
dark
yo creo
because
que
he
no
was
haría nada.
nervous and in love.
Además de que yo puedo
And
con
I
ella, es
will
más
walk
pequeña que yo
forward.
y es muy
If this
flaquilla,
story
o
has
sea, es
reached
muy
you, if you have
pequeñita.
ever had
Entonces,
something that was
me
yours
meto yo poco con
taken
ella.
while
O
the
sea,
person
pero
who
no lo digo
protected it was
porque
unable to speak,
yo sea aquí
tell me in the
la
comments.
que
Tell
voy
me
de
what it
sobrada,
was
no es
and
por
whether you
eso.
found it again.
En plan, es
Tell me
porque es
their
verdad.
name and what they kept for you.
Nos
I
estamos
read
todos puestos de acuerdo
everyone
con
and I
eso.
carry them with me.
Y pues eso,
If you want to
entonces
hear
yo creo
another
que sí que
story
Fata se
about
pone
what people
adelante y
do in
todas
the
esas
dark and what
cosas.
gets left in
Y
documents
nada, y
and
que si
what
en
a
algún momento
grandmother
pasa
can
eso, le
arrange
diré,
from a
mira,
recovery
Ximena,
room when
vale,
she has
le
made
diré,
up her
mira,
mind,
tía,
the
pequeña como
next
la
one
de...
is in the description.
Lo que
It
dicen por
begins with a
ahí,
cedar chest.
en el caso de que
Come
la
with me.
hereda